decent? Now the audio looks decent. That BGM's killing me, man. Yep. Okay, well, this is why we do these audio checks. Ahoy and alway! My name is Faustus Marius Incitatus, the true consul of Rome, the favorite horse of the god Emperor Caligula. So glad you could join me for my second HORSETORY stream. As the title says, we're going to be talking about William Eaton and his absolute mad lad expedition across North Africa during the First Barbary War. It's an amazing story. I think the title really sums it up. It's about pirates, it's about pride, and it's about promises that, well, some of them just couldn't be kept. So, glad everybody could join me. It's looking, oh man, I'm excited for this one. I'm a little nervous, but I'm very excited. So, as I said, I try to do at least one a month. I just barely squeaked in with one this month, but I've been pretty busy distributing bread to the masses, so happy I got this one out. Happy you could join me. And well, I don't have too much more to say, so we'll just get right into it here in a few moments. But how's everybody? Yeah. I promise I can talk. How is everybody's day today? I had a good one, finally got a day off. I'm feeling rested, feeling excited to share this story with you. Yep. Alright. Oh, it's gonna be a good one. Alright. Well, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into this. Boom. And actually, you know what I could do? You know what I should do? Probably. It's good. It's good. Give me one moment. There we go. We'll have the BGM running since there's not going to be any game audio. We can have that going in the background. So, as usual, let me know if it's drowning me out or anything. But yes. So, as we can see, today's HORSETORY presentation is on Pirates, Pride, and Promises, William Eaton and America's War on the Barbary Coast. The Barbary Coast is the, it's the archaic name for the coast of North Africa, so, as you can see on the map. And we are going to jump right into it because, oh boy, we've got a lot to cover, a lot of ground to cover. So, hey, nice. So who were the Barbary Pirates? So North African pirate kingdoms that targeted commerce in the Mediterranean took slaves from non-Muslim coastal settlements in Europe and West Africa. They started in about the 1550s. That's when it got really intense, because that's when the Ottomans kind of decentralized their rule there. All four of the pirate kingdoms that are listed here, Morocco, Algiers, Tunis, and Tripoli, were technically tributaries of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottomans really didn't rule them very closely at all, didn't really watch them very much. As long as the tribute kept flowing in, they didn't care what they did, and what they did was piracy. And slaving, a whole lot of slaving. So operating out of North Africa, they were an absolute terror for commerce in the Mediterranean. Captured Europeans, as it says, they got ransomed if their families were wealthy and were sold off as slaves if they were not. The women tended to go to harems, the men were used for manual labor, and as many as 1.25 million Europeans are estimated to have been taken from 1550 to 1800, and we don't have any sort of records about how bad their raiding on North Africa was, just because the records aren't there, but we can assume it's probably a similar number of West Africans, excuse me, not North Africans, West Africans. So, millions of people enslaved by these pirates, and really, the Barbary Pirates, for a lot of this time period, 1550 to 1800, they were the boogeymen. was the worst possible fate that could possibly befall any Christian man or woman, was to be taken by these people, because they would hold you in bondage, they would make you do unspeakable things, especially if you were a woman. So these were the boogeymen, and unfortunately they were very, very real for millions of Europeans along the Mediterranean coast, even a little bit inland. They would go up the rivers occasionally, not as often as, say, the Vikings, but occasionally, so nobody was safe. The only way for many centuries for anyone to be safe would be for your government to pay tribute to the pirates. And this is what pretty much every European power was doing by the 1700s. They were paying huge sums, and the pirates were basically being paid to do nothing, to not raid these kingdoms in Europe. But if you fell behind on your tribute payments, if you decided not to pay, then they would come at you with a vengeance. They would burn your cities, they would take everyone as slaves. It was just a nasty state of affairs, and these 4 pirate kingdoms, the Barbary kingdoms, were propped up for centuries with this business model. There was not a whole lot of trade, there was not a whole lot of production that they did. This was their state income, this is how they survived. So it was a really terrible situation that nobody could really do anything about. Nobody had the will to do anything about for several centuries, and kind of one of the unspoken tragedies, really, that it went on for as long as it did. But by the 1800s, things were beginning to change, and it all starts with this episode. So, the First Barbary War. When Thomas Jefferson was running for president, he talked a lot about this, and he wanted the United States to be a sort of example for the rest of the world. Obviously, he was hugely influential in the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, drafting those. And so he really believed ideologically that the United States should be different. The United States should be setting the example for the rest of the world. So he promised in his presidential campaign to end these tribute payments. He promised to stop sending U.S. tax dollars to these pirates who enslave people, who steal, who raid commerce, and instead set an example that the rest of the world can follow, that these people should be stood up to. They shouldn't be coddled, they shouldn't be paid tribute to. So it was probably because of that rhetoric that when Thomas Jefferson was elected president, Pasha Yusuf Karamanli of Tripoli, he demanded a huge amount from tribute from the USA, because it was customary to pay tribute to the pirates whenever the government was changed. So the US had to look forward to paying this huge amount, which was several $1 million in today's currency. Every time they had a new president. Thomas Jefferson was not really about that, and frankly, the United States was not rich enough at that point to really be paying that. So Jefferson absolutely supported breaking with that tradition, and he refused Pasha Yusuf's demand. So Yusuf does what the Barbary states always do when someone refuses to pay tribute. They declared war, and Tripoli became the first country in history in 1801 to officially declare war on the United States. Jefferson responded, of course. He sent a U.S. Navy squadron under Commodore Preble to blockade Tripoli, but for the first 2 years, not a whole lot happened. The Mediterranean, especially around Tripoli, was not very navigable most of the year, especially in the winter. The waves were just too strong. There were a lot of really dangerous coral reefs. The U.S. Navy picked off a few corsairs, they took a few prize ships, but they never could really get in close enough to do an effective bombardment of Tripoli, which is what probably needed to happen in order to secure a victory. So pretty much a stalemate the first 2 years of Barbary War, and some discontent was beginning to grow in the United States about that, because obviously nobody wants to lose a war, and it was not going well for the first 2 years. Just a lot of money being spent paying for the Navy, and not a whole lot of results. So, the turning point occurs on Halloween 1803, Halloween horror on the USS Philadelphia. So, in 1803, the USS Philadelphia, a big frigate. This was like the serious battleship of the age. 36 guns. It's under Captain William Bainbridge, and it spots a Tripolitanian ship. It spots it at dawn on October 31st. It's And the Tripolitanian ship, it taunts them. It flies its own colors, which is something you almost never do at this time. Because, like, how to explain it? The naval etiquette at that time is that you can absolutely fly different colors. You can say you're from a different country to avoid confrontation with somebody you're at war at. It's something that everybody does. The only point of etiquette is that you need to raise your true colors. You need to raise your flag before you start actually shooting at someone. But the Tripolitanian ship didn't do this. It was flying the banner of Tripoli the whole time, taunting the USS Philadelphia. And so the Philadelphia follows it. They try to take it as a prize, and they chase it, and they chase it. It's trying to get back to the harbor in Tripoli. It's going really fast. Bainbridge kind of wants to let up once they get too close, but one of his lieutenants swears that he knows the harbor perfectly. He swears they can go in a little bit further. And of course, a little bit further is too far. The the USS Philadelphia gets stuck on a reef that nobody knew was there. It wasn't on any of the naval charts, and it is completely lodged. The ship's crew tries really desperate measures. They cut the anchors, they throw most of the cannons, most of their cargo overboard. They even cut down the topmast. They have to lean it to the left to get off of this reef, because they know the Barbary Pirates are coming if they can't escape. Unfortunately, nothing works. Throwing everything overboard, cutting down the topmast. The topmast actually falls in the wrong direction and lodges them further onto the reef. So it would be kind of a hilarious series of events if it wasn't such a serious situation. But by the afternoon, they're still stuck. They don't know what to do. They've tried pretty much everything. And the Barbary Pirates, they start emerging from the harbor in all of their ships. Fortunately for the USS Philadelphia, the Barbary Pirates don't get too close. They're still very much afraid of those 36 guns on the Philadelphia. And the Philadelphia is taking a few pot shots at them. But unfortunately, because of how they're lodged, it's actually beginning to start fires in their gunnery deck. So they can't take too many shots, but still, it's a bit of a stalemate. The Barbary Pirates can't get too close, but Bainbridge sees this, and he realizes that, well, he believes that the situation is kind of hopeless. Even though the pirates haven't gotten close, even though the pirates are giving them some space, he knows that if they come in close, it's going to be a really bloody battle that they probably are going to have a tough time winning. So he decides, rather curiously, to give up. He surrenders around 3 p.m. and strikes the colors, despite not being hit by any of the enemy's cannons, but despite none of them even being very close to him. Bainbridge decides to surrender, and it's actually not the first time that he's done this. During the quasi-war with France, he slid up on a French ship unbeknownst. The French were flying the British colors, which was something I talked about earlier. So he went right up to them with no caution, and then the French raised their flag, and Bainbridge surrendered that ship as well. So not unprecedented for Bainbridge to surrender a ship without much of a fight, and that's what he does, unfortunately. Without firing a shot, without any damage, no fatalities, Bainbridge surrenders the ship. 307 American sailors are taken as slaves of the Barbary Pirates. They're not prisoners of war. They are held in a dungeon. They are forced to work manual labor. The enlisted sailors, at least. The officers are given a bit better treatment. They let them stay in the castle and kind of do whatever, but 307 American sailors taken as slaves. It's the worst naval disaster in American history up to that point. And all due to Bainbridge's incompetence, completely self-inflicted. So Bainbridge doesn't look too good in this. Again, the second time he has surrendered an American ship. And he does so without them even taking a shot. So Halloween horror on the USS Philadelphia, for sure. The pirates absolutely swarm the ship once they strike the colors. Eventually, they do. That's actually another funny anecdote about this. So they strike the colors around 3 o'clock, and they begin scuttling the ship. They begin making it so that the pirates can't use the ship for themselves. But the pirates are really cautious. They see them striking their colors. They see them putting down the flag, waving the white flag of surrender. The pirates think it's a trick. And why wouldn't it be? The thing's got 36 guns. If they get in close, they're going to get absolutely annihilated. So the pirates are really cautious. The pirates stay back for an hour and just don't buy the bait. And this causes a huge problem because they began scuttling the ship, and the ship is beginning to sink. So if the pirates don't come and get them, they might actually end up drowning. So they have to do a whole lot. They're all out there waving white flags, they're shouting, they're doing whatever they can to get the pirates to actually believe them that they are surrendering, because even the pirates didn't believe that the Philadelphia was going to give up this easily. But that's what ultimately happened. The pirates storm aboard, they strip the sailors of everything that they have, down to their skivvies, take everything, load them on boats, and drag them into Tripoli to serve as slaves. So 307 American sailors taken as slaves that way. It's an absolute embarrassment. So this is where William Eaton enters. William Eaton is the main character, the protagonist in today's presentation. He's a disgraced former American consul to Tunis, which is one of the other Barbary states, and he was disgraced thanks to the piracy of the Tunisians. He in I believe it was 1801, a town on Sardinia was raided by the Tunisians. They couldn't pay their rents. They couldn't pay their protection money, so the Tunisians raided it, took a bunch of people captive, including a noble girl by the name of Anna Porcile. And Anna's family came to Tunis. They were trying to raise money to pay the ransom for Anna before she gets sent off to some harem somewhere. They were looking and looking and looking. Nobody wanted to extend them any credit because they couldn't afford the ransom. Eaton steps in, and without any approval from the government, he extends credit from the United States of America to free Anna Porcile. And this causes a problem when the Count can't pay the money back. The next time an American ship shows up in Tunis, it gets impounded because, well, the Bey of Tunis is expecting his payment for that slave. So Eaton gets blamed for it, as rightly he should. And he is disgraced and stripped of his consulship of Tunis. So he's looking to prove himself. As that story proves, he's a very hard-headed, loud, stubborn, a bulldog of a man, acts without thinking. He is, as Team America would put it, an absolute dick. But the world needs those sometimes, and the world needed William Eaton right now. So he served in the American Revolution, joined up at age 14. He was educated at Dartmouth. He had a brilliant military career, really rose through the ranks before disgracing himself in Tunis. And he, of course, hates the idea of paying tribute to the Barbary Pirates, especially since it kind of ruined his career. He views it as a stain on American honor, and so on and so forth. He loves Jefferson's rhetoric about not paying off the pirates, but hates that Jefferson doesn't even do much about it, that the war is going poorly. And, well, he just happens to be in Washington, D.C. in 1804. He wants to lobby the government to cover that huge expense account from Tunis that he ran up, freeing Anna Porcile, and a few other things that just didn't go right for him. So that's why he's in Washington, D.C., early 1804. And, well, he just happens to be there when... Oh, actually, never mind. But he happens to be there when the news hits. I think this might be out of order. Anyways, let's talk a little bit about Hamet Karamanli before we get to the mission. So, Hamet Karamanli is the brother of the current Pasha of Tripoli, Yusef. Hamet was, well, he was a nice guy. He was a very nice guy. Too nice, probably, to be running a pirate state. He's polite and kind. He's also weak, sheltered, and indecisive, and those kinds of people just get eaten alive when they're thrust into leadership positions. So, in 1790, Yusef proves that he's absolutely suited to be a pirate king. He murders his eldest brother Hassan right in front of their mother, and does it in the harem, I believe, which is a big no-no in Islam. But He brutally does it. When Hamet cedes the throne in 1795, Yusef is very quick to overthrow him because he knows that Hamet is weak. He's not going to be able to do anything about it, and he's 100% correct. So, when Tripoli declares war on the United States, of course, the United States starts looking around and seeing what possible solutions there might be, and that's when Hamet comes to the attention. So Eaton, while he's the consul in Tunis, actually ends up saving Hamet's life. Yusef wanted to lure him into a trap. He offered him a position in his government, but Eaton had heard from some sources that it was actually a trap, that Hamet was going to execute, or that Yusef was going to execute Hamet when he came there. So Eaton warns Hamet. He tells him not to go, and he saves his life, and kind of just tells him, hey, pay it back in the future, because he knows there might be some potential here to maybe overthrow Yusef, since there is another claimant to the throne. So Eaton saves Hamet's life, and that's kind of the situation they're in. They know that Hamet could be an asset. They know that he's somewhere, he's out there, he has a claim to the throne. He's not very strong, so he's going to require a lot of support, but it's an asset. It's something you could use. So that's Hamet Karamanli, and he's going to be kind of the co-protagonist in this story. So anyways, there we go. That was the slide I was expecting. So, in 1804, while Eaton is in DC asking to try and get his expense account from Tunis handled by Congress, because if he didn't, he would have to pay for it himself, and he didn't have that kind of money. So the news of the Philadelphia finally reaches America, almost 5 months after it occurs. And it causes an uproar, an absolute uproar. Like I said, it's the worst naval disaster in the history of the United States so far. It's absolutely disgraceful that these sailors are being treated as slaves instead of proper prisoners of war. And it sparks a serious, serious war fever. The National Intelligencer proclaims millions for defense, but not a cent for tribute. It calls on Jefferson to raise another fleet to go and beat the crap out of Tripoli and free these American prisoners. So Eaton is all for that as well, and Eaton is aware of Hamet, and he thinks that, hey, this might be a really neat way to resolve the situation. What if we just sponsored Hamet and let him contest the throne, depose Yusef, and then he'll owe us. Hamet will be friendly to America, he'll surely release the slaves, and Eaton meets with President Jefferson in late March and pitches this idea. And Jefferson is surprisingly very receptive to the idea. He appoints Eaton as a Navy agent, sends him off, and he's basically sending him off for the first covert operation in America's history to cause regime change, which is of course something that would become a great favorite of America later on. This is the first one. They're looking to replace Yusef with Hamet. So Eaton's mission is to go and find Hamet, help him raise an army, overthrow Yusef. Jefferson promises a ton of support, including field artillery, 1,000 muskets, support from the U.S. Navy, a ton of money to help him raise a mercenary army to pay off people. So it's looking like there might actually be a chance, and Eaton, of course, is absolutely ecstatic to be given a mission like this. He's an extremely patriotic man, and he wants to prove himself, especially after disgracing himself in Tunis. He wants to prove himself as a hero, and he believes that if he pulls this off, he's probably more likely to get his expense account handled by Congress as well. That's always on Eaton's mind. It's something that weighs on him heavily. It's something that motivates a lot of what he does. So Eaton absolutely accepts, and Eaton goes off and starts preparing to head to the Barbary coast on a covert mission. So it takes a while though. Eaton is set to depart with that new squadron that Jefferson was bound to raise. Congress raised about $1 million. They brought up a few new ships, and Eaton is supposed to go with them and depart for the Mediterranean under Commodore Samuel Barron, who's meant to replace Commodore Preble in the Americans. They're in the Mediterranean. So some informants start asking about Hamet at the same time, try and figure out where he is. They learn he's in Egypt, and he's probably in a really, really dangerous situation. We'll go into Egypt a little bit more, but Egypt is basically an anarchy at this time. It's a civil war between several different factions. Everybody is fighting everybody. Bandits are roaming the countryside, and Hamet is somewhere in there. So Eden has to go into that cage match, basically, and find this guy, get him out of there, and raise an army. So Jefferson learns about this, and he starts to develop a few misgivings, which, you know, it's understandable. It's understandable. Jefferson was always kind of an idealistic guy, and I'm sure when Eden pitched it to him, it sounded great. Jefferson maybe got a bit carried away, didn't really consider the practicality of everything. So he begins to develop some misgivings. He slashes the budget to 20,000, slashes it in half, and he tells Baron that it can only be dispersed if Baron, the Commodore, thinks that the mission is a good idea. So around this time, Jefferson also has some discussions with his cabinet and begins to accept the idea of paying a secret ransom for the Philadelphia's crew. If it's going to end the war, if it's going to kind of end this stain, this PR nightmare that he's having, he's okay with paying a bit of money. So some things really quickly begin undermining Eden's mission. The budget is slashed, and Jefferson is okay with the idea of paying a secret ransom. So finally, a few months later, Eden sets sail on July 4th. He has no guarantee of any support. He has to convince Baron to support him. And he tries to do that. He talks Baron's ear off during the long trip to the Mediterranean, but unfortunately, he's kind of an army guy, and he's pitching a land strategy to someone in the Navy. So it's a little difficult. It's tough to convince Baron to do anything. Baron's also kind of just a, how to put it? He's a very cautious man in general. So Eden was going to have a heck of a time convincing him no matter what. He doesn't have a whole lot of luck on the trip over there. And by the time they get to the Mediterranean, Baron becomes extremely ill, and pretty much everything gets put on hold for several months. Baron is basically lying on what he thinks is his deathbed, unable to do anything. And Eden, of course, needs Baron's approval before he goes and does anything. So Eden, very unhappily, kind of just sits around in the Mediterranean, visits a few of the towns. Not really a very happy tourist at this time, because he's just sitting around, he's doing nothing, and those American prisoners are just wasting away as slaves in Tripoli all the while. But finally, with the help of the previous Commodore Preble, who's more supportive of the mission, and with the help of Baron thinking that he's very near death, so he should probably get a few things done before he dies, Eden finally gets approval to begin his mission. He doesn't get a whole lot of money, but he gets enough, and he gets the brig Argus. And on the Argus, he departs for Alexandria, arrives on November 26th. So as I mentioned, Egypt is not a very pleasant place at the time. In fact, it's in total chaos. The Napoleonic Wars are going on at the same time. Napoleon had occupied Egypt and then been chased out of the British, and when that happened, well, the British chased Napoleon out and they were done. That's all they wanted to do, so they just left, and it kind of left the entire place in pure chaos. I know, the British not really considering their actions and leaving somewhere in chaos once their needs are met. I haven't heard that one before. Anyways, Egypt's in pure chaos. It's nominally ruled by the Ottomans, but their Pasha only controls Alexandria, which fortunately is where Eden is landing. Unfortunately, in Cairo, which is the most important city in Egypt, a breakaway faction of the Ottomans under the Albanian warlord Muhammad Ali controls Cairo, and it's butting heads with the Ottomans, and also the Mamluks, who were the previous controllers of Egypt before even the Ottomans, control the south. And there's 24 different warring Mamluk beys, which are basically dukes, all fighting each other and all fighting Muhammad Ali and the Pasha in Alexandria for control of Egypt. It's pure chaos. There are Bedouin raiders, of course, running rampant all over the countryside doing banditry. This is hell on earth that Eden is stepping into, and he's hoping to find Hamet. He's got to cross the country to do so. It's extremely, extremely dangerous, to say the very, very least. My headphones. One moment. Okay. Gotta love when you kick your headphones out. Anyways, yes, so an extremely, extremely dangerous situation. And that's to say nothing of all of the other effects that the battle between the French and the British had on Egypt. There are a bunch of bandits from both of those armies as well roaming around Egypt. They get separated from their army. They decide to become mercenaries / bandits. It's just a terrible situation. He couldn't have picked a worse time. Hamet couldn't have picked a worse place to be other than, well, maybe Tripoli. So this is what Eaton is stepping into. He has a small party, including his own stepson, that is going into this nightmare. And it's just going to get worse, unfortunately, for Eaton. So Eaton sets off to save Private Caramanli. He meets with pretty much his only ally in Egypt, which is the British consul Samuel Briggs. Briggs is very sympathetic to his mission. There was a pretty good rapport between the British and the Americans at this time, especially because the British thought that maybe the Americans could eventually be an ally against Napoleon. So the British did their best to work with the Americans at this time. Briggs also is ideologically very sympathetic to the idea of giving the Barbary Pirates their comeuppance. So Briggs is an absolute bro. He absolutely saves Eaton in Egypt. He reveals that Hamet has joined up with the Mamluks in the south, and so Eaton decides to head down the Nile and go look for Hamet. He sets off for Cairo right away to learn more, to figure out Hamet's exact location. He has 7 men with him, just 7 men, including a few Marines, his stepson, and some midshipmen, and they just pretend to be American officers on vacation. Eaton makes himself a general's uniform that he'll end up wearing for the next few months. And they finally reach Cairo. And in Cairo, as a fun little historical footnote, these were the first Americans that the people in Cairo had ever seen, so they organized a big parade for them. Everybody turned out in the city, thronging the streets to see these Americans. They were tremendously disappointed to see Eaton and some other European-looking guys because their image of Americans was Indians. So they thought there would be people in big feather headdress and leathers and that sort of thing, and they were extremely disappointed to see that these were the Americans. They looked just like the Europeans. So that was kind of a funny thing, but still, they were big stars. They were it made quite a stir when they showed up in Cairo, and it was enough of a stir that Eaton got himself invited to a party at the house of the Pasha. Eaton attends that banquet and meets with the Pasha in private. The Pasha is a very, very perceptive man, and he realizes that Eaton is probably not just here on vacation. So the Pasha kind of probes him a bit to figure out what he's doing, and Eaton once again shows his insane mad lad bravery and tells the Pasha straight up that he is looking for Hamet. He wants to extract him and go overthrow Yusuf in Tripoli, which is modern-day Libya. So that was, again, a huge risk because Hamet was fighting with the Pasha's enemies in the Mamluks. So, but thankfully, the Pasha, he seems swayed, and that makes sense. Like, if you can get someone out of the enemy's ranks without having to fight them, you probably would support that. So, the Pasha makes the wise decision and supports, or at least indicates that he might be willing to support Eaton's mission and get Hamet a pardon so that he can get out of Egypt. However, the French, as usual, stand in the way. The French consul hears about what Eaton is... Well, hears that Eaton is in town. He also learns that he has the support of the British, and so, of course, the French are extremely wary of anyone who is working with the British. So the French consul begins spreading some vicious rumors about Eaton's party, that he's working for the British, that he's trying to take over Egypt instead. And Eaton to win the Pasha's trust, ends up borrowing $2,000 from the British. He borrows it from a different country to complete this mission. He buys the Pasha's trust with this huge bribe, successfully gets that pardon letter for Hamet, and immediately sends out 4 messengers to find Hamet and secretly deliver the pardon. And this was a very, very good move, sending out the 4 messengers, because, well, it's absolute anarchy out there, and if anyone found that Hamet was trying to get out of the Mamluk army, the Mamluks would probably kill Hamet. So the messengers were told to destroy the message if they were captured, and he sent 4 of them, which was a really good move. So he's done all he can. He sends the letter off to Hamet, tells him to meet him in Alexandria with the pardon so you can get out and so that we can put you on the throne, buddy. Eaton then goes about trying to recruit some mercenaries to build an army to support Hamet's efforts. So, surprisingly, the ruse actually works. 3 of the messengers that Eaton had sent were captured and did as they were told and actually destroyed the letter. The 4th one made it through, and he got a response from Hamet and returned to Eaton. Hamet managed to slip away. He did so without alerting the Mamluks to what was going on, and Eaton tells him that they should meet in Alexandria. Eaton has raised a few mercenaries. Some of the big ones that he found was a company of Greek mercenaries, actually, under Captain Santorini, I think was his name. He finds a company of Greek mercenaries to work with him. He also finds, interestingly, an entire French artillery crew. And these guys were left behind when Napoleon retreated from Egypt and decided to not go back, just be mercenaries instead. So he has some artillerymen, he has some Greek fighters, he has some people from several other different nationalities. It really is kind of a rainbow coalition that Eaton is cobbling together here of whoever he can find, whoever's willing to work with him. So Eaton sets off. He finally reaches Alexandria and gets another letter from Hamet that says they should meet at Lake Fayoum, which is 180 miles to the south. Unfortunately, this letter is out of date, and that was something that happened very often with the postal system at this time, especially since Hamet didn't have the foresight to actually date his letters. The letter that Hamet had written later actually got to Eaton first, and then he gets this first one saying they should meet somewhere else. So confusion reigned, but Eaton can't take the risk. He needs to set off for Lake Fayoum. He just has to assume that this is the more recent one. So he sets off to the south. He sets off on the Nile and into absolute anarchy. While he's riding on the Nile, he notices several villages being raided by Bedouins, just sees absolute poverty, absolute desperation. Finally, at Demenhur, which is pretty close to Lake Fayoum, suspicious Albanian soldiers, this was Muhammad Ali, one of the factions that was vying for control of Egypt, they detain the party, as they should, because, again, this guy is moving in the interior of the country, claims to just be on vacation, but, you know, he's in uniform, he's got soldiers with him, it's pretty suspicious. So the Albanian soldiers detain the party, he spends several days in prison, but luckily a Bedouin is nearby, and he confirms he's happened to hear about Hamet, he happened to hear that Hamet is coming to this area, and he goes and fetches him. And after a long wait, after a small bribe to the Albanian soldiers, Eaton is finally freed, and on February 4th, after several perilous months in absolute anarchy, Eaton meets Hamet, finally. And Eaton, because this is the kind of guy he is, immediately swears to Hamet that he will restore his throne or he will die trying. And I believe 100% that Eaton actually thought this was what he was going to do. He meant it 100%. That's just, he was the kind of person that Eaton was. Absolutely earnest. And when he said he was going to do something, he would move heaven and earth to do it. So Eaton, after this absolutely insane trek across Egypt, now the real fun begins. Now he can finally begin his real expedition. After going through anarchy here in Egypt, he meets with Hamet, and they are finally ready to go. So they reach Alexandria, but the trouble continues, of course. The French continue to scheme against Eaton, and the French get to the admiral of the port in Alexandria and let them know that these people are not to be trusted. So, unfortunately, that means Hamet is not allowed in Alexandria. He's not allowed to use the port to embark from Alexandria. So they're kind of stuck. There is no other good port nearby. And so they don't know what to do. The French have really kind of got them in a bad place here. And they eventually decide to do something completely unprecedented. And instead of taking a ship like any normal sane person would, they're going to march the army across 500 miles of North African desert and attack Derna, which is the first major Tripolitanian city. They're going to attack it from the east, which again has never ever been done in military history before. So Eden sends a letter off to Baron. He tells him what the plan is and asks to meet him near Derna with supplies, guns, and naval support and everything. And I cannot stress enough, he is literally betting his life on Baron following through with this. He doesn't even know if Baron is still alive, much less if he's going to support this mission. Baron didn't seem too keen on it. He didn't have a lot of luck convincing Baron to support the mission before. But Eden, the absolute mad lad, is betting his life that this letter will convince Baron. Baron will send the supplies, the guns, and the naval support once they've crossed these 500 miles of desert. If he's wrong, if Baron is not there, Eden is dead. His whole party is probably dead. They will surely be low on supplies. They will be in enemy territory. They will have nothing. But Eden bets his life on it, bets everything on getting Hamet on the throne. So this, more than anything, I think shows the kind of person that William Eaton was. He was a mad lad. He was absolutely laser focused on making this work. He was willing to take any risk, brave any danger. And this right here, just betting his life that Baron will follow through and meet them at Derna, before setting off across 500 miles of desert, something that's never been done with an army before. This is Eden in a nutshell. So, by the end, Eden has raised 78 Christian mercenaries from various different countries. Again, the Greek contingent is the largest there. He also borrows 8 U.S. Marines and 2 midshipmen from the Argus. He sends his stepson back onto the Argus, which at least he has some sense. The stepson was only like 17 years old at this time. But yeah, he sends his stepson back on the Argus. These mercenaries, the Marines and the midshipmen, is going to set off across the desert. Hamet has raised roughly 200 Arab cavalrymen, and again, he's done so at America's expense. Eden had a small amount of money that he shared with Hamet, and Hamet raised those cavalrymen to complement his own entourage. So they have just about 400. Little less than 400 soldiers that they're going to set off across the desert and conquer a city with. To get there, Eden and Hamet negotiated a deal with Sheikh Tayyib, who's a Bedouin in the area. Sheikh Tayyib is going to provide a caravan across the desert and also serve as a mercenary. Tayyib is going to lead Hamet's Arab cavalrymen in battle, supposedly. So they negotiate that deal. They shake on it. They come to an agreement, and immediately Tayyib tries to rip them off. The following day, he demands more money to go, but Eden, of course, has none of that. He's, again, a very stern and hard-headed man. He calls Tayyib's bluff, basically. And this is something that becomes very, very depressingly common in the journey ahead. Tayyib trying to milk them for more money, Eden having to call the bluff. It's just this theater that happens again and again. It had to be so frustrating, but they're finally ready. Eventually, they have the mercenaries raised, they've gathered some supplies, and they're ready to attempt this crossing of 500 miles of North African desert to attack a city. It's insane. If it sounds insane, it's because it is. But this was the plan, and this was what Eden was betting his life on. And before they set out, this is the promise, and this is why promises is in the title here. Eaton writes up an official agreement on behalf of the United States. He has absolutely no authority to do this. None whatsoever. He is just there as a special naval agent. He's not a diplomat. He has no plenipotentiary powers. But he writes up this official agreement on behalf of the United States and presents it to Hamet as such. The convention between the United States of America and His Highness Hamet Karamanli, Bashaw of Tripoli. It has 15 clauses in total. It says that Hamet will repay the U.S. for all of its support when he takes the throne, and that he will be the one paying tribute to the United States, and also to Denmark, Sweden, and the Netherlands. He promises to release all American prisoners for free, treat all future prisoners as POWs, not slaves, and of course he promises eternal peace between Tripoli and the United States. And he will also turn Yusuf over to the United States when he is successful. In return, this is the big one, Eaton promises Hamet the full support of the United States to retake the throne. Hamet thought that he was working with the United States 100%. Really? He was just working with Eaton, and Eaton could scrounge up from the United States. So this was the promise. Full support. This is what Hamet was operating under. And Eaton presented that to Hamet with no authority to do so, no idea if it would actually be honored, except by him. He was willing to do whatever it would take to get Hamet on the throne, and he, well, kind of let that overpower his own judgment. He didn't consider anyone else. He's just going to make this agreement on behalf of the United States. So this was the big promise, and this is why the promise is included in the title of this presentation, because this was how he induced Hamet to do this, and if you haven't guessed, this kind of comes back to bite him in the end. So, they finally set off. The area between Alexandria and Derna is a desert steppe. It's not like the Sahara. It's not big dunes of shifting sands. It's a desert steppe. There's some greenery there. The horses can eat something at least, but it is a desert. It is insanely dry. There's not a whole lot. It's rocky ridges, gullies, some dry plains with a few things for the horses to eat. Water sources up to 50 miles apart. And not all of the water sources were good. A lot of times wells would dry up. If you had bad luck and you ran into a water source that had dried up, it was absolutely possible to die out there. Absolutely likely that you would die out there, especially with a large group. Just one bad water source could kill everyone. And this was what they were marching an army into. On March 6th, they set out, and it's an absolute mess. Again, these are mostly mercenaries. They are setting out with very little organization, very little chain of command, and the caravan, of course, under Taib is just completely useless. It lags far behind. They're not really motivated to do anything. So they make almost no progress. Eaton had hoped to do 40 miles the first day and only made a few. But eventually, Eaton manages to whip them into shape a little bit. Things get under control, and he manages 15 miles on the second day. They stop at a good well. It's a pretty good day, but Eaton is starting to get concerned. He assumed they would be doing 40 miles a day. He bought provisions for the army. They're going at less than half that pace, so you've really got to wonder if it's going to last long enough to reach Derna, or they're going to run out of food and water in the desert and all die. It's a very real possibility, and Eaton's journal starts to get very, very nervous around this time when he realizes this is not going to go nearly as fast as he thinks it will. And then everything starts falling apart. On March 9th, a few days after they set out, Sheikh Taib tries the oldest trick in the book. He halts the caravan and he demands more money before they're going to take a step further. This was, again, the oldest trick in the book, something that caravans did all of the time. And Eaton, to his credit, absolutely calls the bluff. He turns the Christian mercenaries under his command around and starts marching back towards Alexandria, because they're not going to go with that if Taib's going to keep extorting them for more and more money. And, well, Taib's out in the desert as well. He's already wasted a few days if this falls apart, so the bluff is called. Taib continues on. Then the next day, things start really getting out of control. A messenger from Derna arrived, and they apparently have heard that Hamet is coming, that he has an army, and the messenger says that the people of Derna are very supportive of this. They're actually starting to riot against the current governor of Derna, so it sounds like they might actually have a chance to pull this off. So the Arab cavalry are in the front. They hear this news, and they do celebratory gunfire. This is something that they have done for centuries and centuries. If you know Arab culture, celebratory gunfire is something that's really big. So the Arab cavalry in the front start doing celebratory gunfire. The camel drivers in the back hear this, and they assume that this is all a trap. They assume that the Christian troops have lured them out into the desert. They're going to kill them all, take all of their stuff, and they just make this assumption, and they turn on the Christian troops, and the situation becomes really tense. They're pointing guns at each other. Finally, someone has the sense to say, hey, someone go up ahead, make sure what's happening, see what's up. One of the camel drivers does that and diffuses the situation, thankfully, but any trust that might have existed between the Christians and the Muslims in this group, absolutely gone now. They break off into their own separate cliques, and there's that constant tension from that point on between the two religious groups. So not really a great dynamic for an army that's supposed to fight and die together to capture a city, but right away that tension pops up. About a week later, finally, the army reaches the ruins of an old Roman villa, and this is when another problem pops up, when Eaton learns that, well, Hamet apparently had only hired the camel drivers to take his party this far. He didn't hire them to go to Derna, he hired them to take them to this old Roman villa. There's no explanation for this. Eaton was completely mystified, and Eaton is the primary source, his journal, on all of this. Eaton has no idea why Hamet did that, or even if Hamet did that, but this was the new crisis that arrives. So Eaton has to go to Sheikh Taib, this bastard, and straight up beg him on his hands and knees to go for 2 more days so they can reach a friendly Bedouin tribe. He offers all of his remaining cash, and Taib takes the cash and proceeds most of his camel drivers to leave in the night. So things are really falling apart, and they are a good 2 weeks from any sort of civilization either way. But luckily there are enough camel drivers to still limp along. They go for another 2 days and seeking this Bedouin tribe, which again, Bedouins are nomadic. There's no guarantee that they're going to be where you think they're going to be. But, luckily, on March 20th, they finally reached the U'ed Ali, which was the Bedouin tribe. But, of course, more bad news arrives before then. Yusef knows that Eden's army is coming thanks to the French consul back in Alexandria who actually tipped him off. I don't know what they did to piss the French consul off so much, but he was actively working against them the whole time. So the French tips Yusef off about the plan. No more element of surprise. Yusef is sending an army to reinforce Derna. Eden thinks, probably rightly, that, hey, we should hurry up to Derna and beat them there. But Taib wants to wait and make sure that these supposed American supplies are waiting at Bombo, which was the harbor that they were supposed to all reunite in. This is going to take about 10 days, so they're supposed to just sit there and wait and eat the food for 10 days before they finally even hear if the American supplies are waiting at Bombo. So Eden absolutely refuses. Because they're going to run out of food. So Eden refuses. He says he's not going to provide food to anyone who doesn't move forward. And eventually Taib gathers up 50 camels. He takes them to the U'ed Ali. And the next day, they miraculously reach the Bedouin camp. It's really an oasis in the desert in so many ways. Eaton gets a new camel train to carry all of the army's baggage. He also gets 150 Bedouin fighters. And the Bedouins were not a huge fan of Yusuf, mostly because they just hated being taxed. Yusuf taxed them pretty heavily, so they knew that if they supported Hamet, there might be a chance that Hamet would go easy on their tribe and that they could not pay as many taxes. So truly in the American spirit of overthrowing the government so you don't have to pay your taxes, 150 Bedouins join up with the army, and it's really starting to take shape now. They've really avoided a crisis by the Bedouins actually being there. They resupply, they rest up, and they are ready to go. But unfortunately, Taib once again refuses to budge from the Bedouin camp. And at this point, Eaton loses his shit. This was something that Eaton does a lot. It was one of his big faults. He was a pretty patient man. Obviously, he put up with Taib's shit for almost a whole month, but when he loses it, he really loses it. He lashes out at Taib, tells him, "You've promised much and fulfilled nothing." He questions his manhood. He throws every single insult in the book, and Taib slinks away. He storms off. He says he's not going anywhere with Eaton, but he realizes that he's walking away from a ton of money. He's walking away from opportunity if he does that. And like a Giga Chad, Eaton manages to get him to slink back despite that. But of course, Taib is petty and he sabotages the army. He sabotages the march for the rest of the way. It's just going to get worse because they're only about halfway there at this point. So Sheikh Taib truly is the worst. So the army marches on. They really do. Despite all of this, the supplies are starting to run low. They got some from the Bedouins, but again, they have 150 more fighters now, so the supplies... The Bedouins are pretty self-sufficient, but still the supplies are being drawn on. Taib engages in theatrics, and now Hamet starts in as well. He starts to demand that the army stops and waits and hears from Bomba, makes sure that the American supplies are waiting for them, and Eaton responds in the same way each time, calls their bluff, a lot of times calls it with some very harsh language, and each time the theatrics go nowhere, and eventually, after a bunch of wasted time, the army moves on. But, again, supplies running extremely low and morale is tanking. They run out of meat around this time, and they're subsisting only on rice at this point. And then, things get even worse when the well turns up dry that they were counting on. In this very dry patch of desert, there's one well that's good. So this could be a death sentence. As I said before, the wells are extremely far apart, 20 to 50 miles apart, and a well turns up dry. So dehydration is now beginning to set in as people are marching on. They go several days with no water, meager food rations. The horses begin dying. And if the next well is dry, it's probably all over for the entire army. They are all going to die. So you have that hanging over you. You're marching through this inferno the entire day. Just this sea of shrubbery and sand. It's no wonder morale was low. It was a completely awful situation to be in. But they marched on. Eaton was actually a really effective leader. He motivated the Christian troops, at least, the Marines and the mercenaries. He motivated them very well. At this time, they actually even wrote a letter declaring their support. Both the Marines and the Greek troops declared their support for Eaton, declared that they will support him no matter what, and they will stand by him. So he was a very inspiring figure, and that served him well in kind of keeping this ragtag army together and not letting that desperation completely overwhelm everyone. Luckily, on April 8th, the next well is not dry, so they are not immediately in danger of death. They reach a cistern of water, they stop for the day, and everybody is just, well, it's just like you see in those movies when you finally happen upon the oasis. Everybody jumps in, throws the water on their face, they're drinking and drinking and drinking until they throw up, and of course no marching was done that day. They stop for the day, they rest after absolute crisis. But once again, Hammett engages in theatrics. It's like every time that they stop, every time there's an excuse to start thinking about the situation, the theatrics begin again. So Hammett once more demands that they confirm that the US ships are waiting at Bomba. And Eaton realizes now that there are less than a week's worth of rations left. If they stop, they will run out of food. Hammett does the typical thing. He leads the Arabs away. They're going to go to an oasis town a few 100 miles away. Eaton calls the bluff. They return an hour later. That evening, however, Eaton is running the Christian mercenaries through some drills, and there's another misunderstanding. The Muslims see the Christians lining up and preparing to fire. They assume that they're about to attack them. So the Muslims all jump on their horses, they grab their guns, and they ride out to meet the Christians in battle. 200 cavalrymen against probably about 70 at this point infantrymen, 8 US Marines in the center, and surprisingly, the smaller force actually holds its formation, which, to be fair, they were working on staying in formation, they were working on drills, so they were pretty well conditioned for it. They were prepared for that to happen, even if the attack was quite unexpected. So, luckily, no shots are fired yet, but it's an absolute crisis. It's the worst crisis since this entire march across the desert started. This insane expedition. And they're now prepared for battle, prepared to kill each other. And this is the showdown. So, at this time, the leader of the United States Marines, Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon, he takes charge of the situation. He tells the Marines and the mercenaries to hold their ground. They get in formation and they prepare to face down Hammett's troops. Eaton sees this and realizes that, oh my god, they're going to start shooting at each other, we're all going to kill each other, and he once again shows his bravery by marching out in between the two armies. There are dozens of guns aiming at him. One trigger gets pulled, and this ends terribly for everyone involved. Eaton walks towards Hammett slowly, unarmed, showing his hands, and shouting at him to stop this in broken Italian, which was the only language that both of them sort of understood a little bit. And as usual, Hammett is paralyzed for quite some time. Eaton actually reaches him. He marches across, he gets up to Hammett, and he grabs him, takes him aside, and he asks him if he knows who his friends are. He finally slaps some sense into Hammett, and the situation is diffused, but it comes so close. Just one trigger gets pulled, and it's all over. Just an amazingly tense showdown, and handled with some extreme bravery by the Marines and also by Eaton. And Hammett later praises O'Bannon in particular for keeping the Marines together, keeping the Christian mercenaries together, and being cool under pressure, and helping to not escalate the situation, at least. So that's finally taken care of. The crisis is finally past, and they're really close. They're really close. So, on April 10th, a messenger arrives from Bomba, finally, and he claims to have seen American ships in the harbor. So, this reinvigorates everyone. They press on even as their food runs out completely. So they've been about 2 days without food when they finally reach Bomba. And, well, there are no ships in sight. And I can't even imagine. Like, Eden's heart must have just sunk onto the floor. It must have sunk to the 7th level of hell at this point, because, yeah, the gamble, it seemed to have failed on Eden. There were no ships in sight. Maybe the messenger was mistaken and saw some other ship. The Muslims are, of course, furious. They, of course, plan to leave the next day. They're lucky that they didn't straight up attack Eden for misleading them, but they plan to leave the next day. It seems like it's all over. It's going to end here. But on the last day, at dawn, as Hammett and his Arab troops are preparing to leave, Eden glances out at the horizon one last time. It must have felt hopeless. He glances out at the horizon, and he spots something. He spots at the farthest edge of the horizon a little white dot. And that little white dot is the Argus. The U.S. Navy arrives. 3 ships appear on the horizon, the Argus leading them, and they pull into Bomba at the very last moment. It's like, you couldn't write it. You really couldn't even write it more insane, more dramatic than this. It was the last moment. The Arabs were preparing to leave. There was, if they didn't show up then, it was now or never. And at the very last moment, those ships show up, and the entire expedition is saved. Yeah, I don't even know what else to say except you couldn't write it. This is why I love history, because if someone tried to write a fictional story like this, nobody would believe it. Everyone would call it completely overdramatic, completely made up. But this is how it actually went down. At the very last moment, the ships arrive. So Captain Hull, who's the leader of the Argus, he shows up, and he carries, amazingly, a supportive letter from Commodore Barron, who's recovered from his sickness, and he's once again giving orders in the Mediterranean. And Barron is sending pretty much everything that Eaton asked for, amazingly. He's sending the food, the supplies, the weapons, and the money. Of course, he tells Eaton, hey, don't make any official agreements with Hammett or anything. This is a covert operation. Doesn't really know about that doesn't really know about that agreement that Eaton signed with Hammett all the way back in Alexandria. Eaton kind of failed to mention that in the letter that he sent off to Barron. So it's time to prepare for battle. They've actually managed to survive crossing 500 miles of unforgiving desert with an army, half of the army engaging in theatrics, trying to milk them for every last cent half of the way. They have made it. The Argus shows up, 2 more ships show up, they have the supplies. Eaton takes 2 carronades, which are like short-range, high-caliber cannons, takes those to use for artillery off of the Argus, and they march forwards. But then the news comes that Yusef's army, it's now just down to 500 instead of the 800 that they'd heard before, but they've almost reached Derna, and it provokes the typical theatrics from Sheikh Taib. Taib wants to head back. He assumes that they're not going to reach Derna before Yusef's army does, and once Yusef's army reaches Derna, it's gonna be hopeless. So Eaton gets on the Argus with Hull, and he asks for any money that Hull might have. And luckily, they were carrying a few $1,000s on the Argus. This was not earmarked for Eaton's mission or anything. This was just money they had for incidental expenses. Eaton manages to talk Hull out of that money, and he gives that $2,000 bribe to Taib and the Bedouins to move forward. And in 2 days, the army actually reaches Derna from the east. They've reached their destination, and they find it fortified. 800 troops. There's a howitzer atop the castle, but they have managed to beat Yusef's army there. Somehow, they've managed to beat them there. So, Eaton sends a message to the governor of Derna. It's basically a message to surrender. It's worded much more eloquently than just surrender. He asks him to allow them into the city, to not show any resistance, and to stand against Yusef, support Hammett for the throne of Tripoli. And the governor, of course, replies, my head or yours. So it's on. This army of just about 500 men at this point, maybe a little more, is supposed to storm the city, overcome the fortifications of Derna, and raise the American flag, put Hammett on the throne in Derna. And that is exactly what Eaton sets out to do. On April 26th, the Argus, the Hornet, and the Nautilus arrive outside of Derna. Those were the 3 ships that showed up at Bomba, and they're now ready to support the attack on Derna. The Nautilus has 2 brass artillery pieces, like the one pictured there. They're going to use them. The French artillerymen are going to use those to support the attack, to knock down the fortifications. And Eaton, of course, decides to attack as soon as possible once the 3 ships show up. It makes good sense because Yusef's army is on the move. If they reach Derna before they take the city, it's game over. So Eaton decides to attack ASAP, and they develop a plan. Eaton and Lieutenant O'Bannon are going to lead the Christian troops in a frontal assault on the harbor fortress. They're going to storm down from the hills outside of Derna. They're going to overcome the hastily constructed defenses outside of the city, get the harbor fortress, take it over, grab the artillery pieces in the harbor fortress, and turn them on the city. Meanwhile, Hammett is going to flank west with the cavalry. He's going to take a castle on the outskirts of Derna and then rush into the city itself, into its unprotected side. Well, of course, the ships perform a naval bombardment from the harbor. It's a pretty solid plan. Gonna hydrate here for a sec. One moment. Yeah. So yes, we have a pretty solid plan here. It's a very aggressive plan, but they had to be aggressive. Again, Yusef's army was on the move, so this was the only chance they had to take Derna. The Christian troops in particular were going into a very dangerous situation. They were outnumbered heavily, and they were on the offensive, going to try and break these fortifications. But Eaton, once again, absolute mad lad, absolutely aggressive, knows that this is the only chance that they have. And so, as April 27th dawns, they begin unloading the brass artillery pieces from the Nautilus, which is carrying them. Unfortunately, because they're not in the harbor of Derna, because the harbor of Derna is hostile to them, they kind of have to haul the brass artillery pieces up some cliffs. There's a little bit of a beach, and then there's cliffs up to where they are outside of Derna, so they have to haul these brass artillery pieces up some cliffs. It's a very slow, very torturous process. And eventually, Eaton decides that unloading both of these cannons is just going to take too long. They've reached the afternoon, they've only gotten one so far. If they do the process all over again, it's going to be dusk by the time they have both cannons, and there is no time to waste. Yusef's army could show up at any moment. So Eaton, once again, decides to be aggressive, and he attacks with only the 1 brass cannon and the 2 carronades he had from the Argus. So, at 2 p.m. on April 27th, the order to attack is given. The French artillerymen man the cannon, and they start pounding the fortifications of Derna. The Marines lead the Christian mercenaries in a charge, but they quickly get bogged down by withering fire, of course, from the more numerous defenders on the fortifications in Derna. So they're taking cover behind some hills and some outbuildings and getting shot at, getting lit up absolutely brutally. Hammett does his part. He wheels around to the west. He takes the castle, but at that point, he waits. He waits to see how the attack by the Christian troops is going to go down, probably so that he's not left in a terrible position if the Christian troops decide to retreat and he's trapped in the city. So Hammett takes the castle, but then he forsakes the plan and decides to wait. So the ships do their part. They get close to the coastal defenses and bombard them. The Hornet in particular is impressive because it's just a tiny little ship. It gets up close enough that you can shoot pistols at it, which is what they were doing. So the ships are getting shot to hell. They're bombarding the coastal defenses, having a hard time of it. The Marines and the Christian troops are pinned down outside of the city. Hammett is sitting on his ass. He's waiting to see how things develop. And Eaton sees all of this and realizes that if something doesn't change very quickly, the battle is lost. And so, it's like this man only has one gear. It's attack, attack, attack. That's all Eaton knows how to do. And fortunately, that's all he needs to do. Eaton steps out in front of the Christian troops, and he orders a charge. He orders them to charge into the fortifications, charge the numerically superior defenders on the fortifications, and somehow break them. And thankfully, this actually works. Eaton leads the Marines and the the mercenaries out, charges the fortifications. 2 Marines, several Greeks are instantly killed. Eaton gets shot in the left wrist, but stands right back up and continues charging. And the thing about Arab warfare at this time, or warfare in the Arab world, is that it was all pretty much skirmishes. There was not a whole lot of close quarters combat. That was something they tried to avoid. So when these soldiers fix bayonets and start charging, once they reach the fortifications, most of the defenders just melt away. They run away. They're not going to fight close quarters. They're not trained for that. And so when they reach the fortifications, most of the defenders, who again were largely conscripted citizens of Derna, they run away, and the fortifications are taken. Not without cost. Again, several of the soldiers are killed, but once they reach the fortifications, the defenders start to melt away. O'Bannon charges into the harbor fortress, leading the Marines, and finally, at about probably 4:30 p.m., O'Bannon takes the roof of the harbor fortress, which is where the big howitzer was, and he raises the American flag over the city of Derna. This was the first time that the American flag had ever flown over a conquered city outside of North America. A very big moment in the military history of the country. Hammett sees this. He sees the American flag going up over the harbor fortress, and Hammett attacks as well. Now that he knows that it's going well, he leads his cavalry into the city, and that seals it. The rest of the defenders melt away. They see they're being attacked on two fronts now. Most of the defenders, again, conscripted citizens of Derna, so they throw down their weapons, they run back home, and they pretend like they were never in the battle. And that's it. They've actually, somehow, against all odds, managed to march across 500 miles of desert, attack this city with numerically superior defenders, using a tired army, and they've done it. They've taken Derna, which it's just one of the most remarkable episodes in military history of any time, in my opinion. Just the whole expedition, the boldness of the attack, the absolute insanity of Eaton, really, to just go on the offensive with these numerically inferior forces. But it's exactly what he needed to do. If they had been conservative, they would have gotten cut to pieces. So the Battle of Derna, one of my favorite battles in all of military history, really, just because of the absolute insanity of it. Again, if you wrote it that way, nobody would believe it. They'd call it bad fiction. But this is actually what happened, how they took Derna, how the American flag flew over the first foreign city ever. And with Derna taken, suddenly everything has changed. Tobias Lear, we are now going to meet, this is when he steps onto the stage. Tobias Lear is designated as America's chief negotiator with Tripoli. Lear is extremely politically well-connected. He served as George Washington's secretary until he stole money from Washington, at least. He refused to give Washington money from some properties that were paying rent, supposedly to Washington, but Lear held on to it himself. He also... He was a bit of a scumbag, more than a bit of a scumbag. He smoothed and slimed his way up the political ranks. After betraying Washington, he betrays Washington once again after his death by destroying a bunch of Washington's letters that would make Jefferson look bad. Of course, that earns Jefferson's favor, because if those letters were published, it would hurt Jefferson's political career. So he's kind of Jefferson's favorite. He's this very slimy guy. Slimy is the word for him, I think. A very good word for him. He was appointed as a colonel, as a purely political post, and of course demanded to be called Colonel Tobias Lear from then on, despite never seeing any combat, never leading troops. That kind of person. So this is the guy who's managed to smooth his way into being America's chief negotiator with Tripoli, and he hears of the success at Derna. He thinks this is the perfect time to start making peace. Hey, we have a success. We have something we can come at them with. I think now is the perfect time to begin negotiating with the Basha Youssef, especially because Youssef is starting to threaten to kill the American prisoners as his situation gets more desperate. This is 100% a bluff. I cannot stress enough how much Youssef is bluffing here. It makes absolutely no sense to kill the American prisoners, none whatsoever. He can get money for them if he keeps them alive. If he kills them, all he's going to get is a very pissed off fleet showing up at Tripoli looking to absolutely destroy him. There is no reason whatsoever for Yusef to kill the American prisoners. Anybody with any sense would realize this. Eden realized it, most of the political observers at the time realized it. Tobias Lear takes Yusef at his word and believes that the situation is dire. There's a threat that the prisoners will be killed, so let's negotiate right away. Lear, of course, also dislikes Eden. They have a bit of a personal rivalry. He wants to achieve peace and get the big victory before Eden can succeed at anything. So he hears that Eden has taken Derna. He knows now is the time. I need to go and make peace so I can enhance my own reputation. Baron also supports this course. He was never a big fan of Eden's expedition in the first place. He also realizes that his current ships aren't really up to bombarding Tripoli this summer. So he doesn't believe in Hammett, he doesn't believe in the mission, so he sends a letter to Eden congratulating him for taking Derna, but telling him to leave because we're going to make peace. So this is where the stab in the back really, really begins, with Tobias Lear and his determination to make peace at any price. He knows Jefferson is willing to pay a ransom in secret if it's going to end the war, and he fully intends to act on that. Meanwhile, in Tripoli, when the news of Derna reaches Tripoli, it sends the entire city into a panic. Anarchy on the streets, pretty much. Yusef goes into complete emergency mode. He empties out his treasury. He sells off a bunch of the royal artifacts. He takes the servants down to 1 meal a day. He absolutely does everything he can to buy the loyalty of the local tribes, because now his rule is threatened, so he needs to make sure the local Bedouin tribes are loyal, otherwise they're going to side with Hammett, and also to send more equipment and troops to retake Derna. And one of the American prisoners at this time observes that the greatest terror and consternation reigned throughout the whole town when news of the fall of Derna finally reaches Tripoli. At this time, the Bashaw is overheard saying that he would gladly release the prisoners without a ransom if it would make peace. He's on his knees. It's absolute chaos in Tripoli. He has completely exhausted all of his resources. His rule is shaky now with this loss of this city. He is in the mood to make peace. He's willing to do whatever he can to save his own skin, to keep himself on the throne. And if releasing the prisoners is what it takes, he would do that in a heartbeat if America asked. But with Lear coming, the question is America going to ask? And unfortunately, the answer is no. The answer is absolutely not. Lear arrives in Tripoli on May 26th and begins negotiations with Yusef. Yusef is represented by the Danish consul Nicholas Nissen, who was a very honorable guy. He was the one supporting the American officers and kind of making their existence comfortable. He did that out of his own pocket, so he was someone that was liked by both sides of the arrangement, but secretly he was kind of working for Yusef. Yusef promised to give favorable treatment to Denmark on the tribute payments if Nissen got a good deal out of Lear. So that was Nissen's angle, and well, he unfortunately did a very good job. The negotiations are difficult. They go back and forth a few times. Lear even threatens to walk away, but he was always resolved on paying a ransom. He wouldn't even explore the idea of pushing the Bashaw to release the prisoners without any ransom, of intimidating the Bashaw. He was not intent on doing that, because, well, frankly, he was just kind of a weak person. He wanted that political achievement. He wanted to be the man who made peace. He was willing to pay whatever, even if that included $60,000 out of the American taxpayer's pocket to free these prisoners. So that is the agreement they come to. On June 3rd, the preliminary treaty is finally concluded. The American prisoners get freed the following morning after 579 days in captivity, and the Bashaw absolutely cashes in. He gets far more than he was expecting. Again, he was willing to let them go for free if it would end the war, because this was ruining him. But Lear was 100% intent on making peace at any price, never explored any of that, had no faith in Eaton, didn't believe that the capture of Derna would have any effect on Tripoli. And yeah, he concludes this treaty. It's really, really unfortunate because just about 2 days after Lear departs to Tripoli to begin negotiations, this gigantic American fleet arrives with news from Washington and orders from Washington to continue the war in Tripoli, to bombard the city, and to not make any peace until they are on their knees. So this was the orders from Washington were to be aggressive. The orders from Washington were to not do this, not sell out, because they felt that they wanted to give it one more try and try to force peace and force the freeing of those American slaves without any sort of a payment. But unfortunately, the message doesn't get to Tripoli in time. Lear doesn't hear about it, and he concludes the negotiations under these false pretenses that, oh, we're not going to be able to bombard them this summer, so might as well end it here. And that's what happens. Lear sells out. The treaty they end up signing is really kind of awful. I get emotional talking about this because it's just, how could you mismanage it this badly? So America agrees to pay $60,000 in ransom for the prisoners. It was not a tribute, mind you. They hadn't paid a cent for tribute. They were just paying a ransom. So Jefferson's catchphrase was still upheld. He could bring that up if he was pressed on it. So the $60,000 ransom was paid. Yusef was promised not to target American ships anymore, but of course the US has no means of enforcing this short of another war. He also promises not to enslave future prisoners of war for when he inevitably attacks American ships again, but it formalizes the dollar amount that each rank shall be ransomed for. I think it was $100 for a rank-and-file soldier, $300 for a mate, and $500 for a captain or a high-ranking officer. So this basically formalizes and fully encourages Yusef to take American prisoners again, because he knows exactly how much each one will be worth. They're walking money bags, basically. It's mind-boggling. It's truly mind-boggling. He can take these Americans prisoner. He knows exactly how much he's going to get for each of them. How could this not encourage him to do it again? On the flip side, America promises to leave Derna and withdraw all support for Hamet. This was the #1 demand that Bashaw Yusef made during the negotiations. He wanted them to promise to leave Derna, withdraw all support for Hamet, because he was genuinely threatened by what was happening, and Lear did not pick up on that one little bit. So that was top of the list for Tripoli to make peace. America had to promise to leave Derna, withdraw all support for Hamet. Yusef, in the meanwhile, promised to release Hamet's relatives, who he was holding hostage in Tripoli, but a secret clause gives Yusef 4 years to release Hamet's family, by which time the US is not going to be likely to be interested in enforcing this clause, and he knew it. This was initially during the negotiations. It was just supposed to be release Hamet's relatives right away. This was America doing right by Hamet, who they were abandoning. But Yusef managed to talk Lear down from that and insert a secret clause that he has plenty of time to release Hamet's family, and he's probably not going to do it because the US won't be interested in enforcing that clause. And as long as he's got Hamet's family hostage, he has leverage over Hamet. So just brutal, absolutely brutal. The United States gets basically nothing out of this. They end up paying a ransom. They set up a system by which Yusef is fully encouraged to attack Americans again and enslave them. They withdraw all support for Hamet. They give up on Eaton's so far successful expedition. And it's all for nothing. It's all for the vanity and the glory of Tobias Lear. And that's how it goes down. The treaty is signed, it goes into law, the war is over. Woohoo! Finally, meanwhile at Derna, in early May, Yusef's army has grown to 1,000 soldiers now, and it arrives at Derna in early May. The governor of Derna, who had fled into a wealthy citizen's harem after the capture of the city, escapes, and he immediately orders Yusef's army to attack. It's a near thing, actually. They attack the town. Excuse me. Must hydrate. It's a near thing, actually. They attack the town. They actually manage to breach into Derna through the defenses. Yusef's army does. They chase Hamet's army all the way to nearly the governor's palace, but then fire from the coastal defenses, and very notably, the support from the locals of Derna drive off Yusef's forces. The locals, Eden had kind of been telling the locals about America, and they were very keen on the idea. They really liked the idea that this country would support Hamet, that they would try to make things more just and equal. Eden's talking a big game about America. He's really selling the populace on it, and so when the time comes, a lot of the populace at Derna buys in, and they actually support Eden's army in defending the town against Yusef. On May 28th, Eden does what he does. He launches another bold attack and destroys an enemy scouting party in the hills outside of Derna. He just barely escapes when the main army shows up. So this was kind of Eden learning the limits and realizing that bold attack is not going to work here. They are pinned down. They are besieged at Derna. However, morale in Yusef's army is terrible, and Eden knows it. He knows that the Bedouins really hate Yusef. They hate paying taxes to Yusef, so if he could get the message to them that they would be better under Hamet, maybe give them a little bit of a bribe, he knows the Bedouins in Yusef's army, which was about half of the army at the time, would all switch to Hamet quite easily. And he says in his journal, "We want nothing but cash to break up our enemy's camp." But of course, no support is coming. Baron is not going to support the effort anymore, and Lear is actively working to make peace at this time. But it was so close. He could taste victory just a little more, and he knew the army would break. Morale was terrible. But on May 31st, Baron's letter arrives. Eden is... I can't imagine. He was a very, very emotional man, so I can't imagine how he reacted to some of these things. The string of curse words that must have come out when he saw this letter telling him to leave, that they were going to make peace. Eden is devastated, but you know, the orders are just to evacuate Derna at your leisure, so Eden decides he's going to stay in Derna as long as he possibly can, and evacuate at his leisure sometime in the far future. So he wants to hold out until that peace is official. Again, this is very good thinking by Eden, because if the peace negotiations break down, then you're basically just handing Derna back to the enemy. So Eden, once again, showing far more sense than Tobias Lear. He decides to interpret the orders loosely, hold out in Derna for as long as he can. He's not going to leave until he hears that the treaty has been concluded, and that he does. Eden is also extremely concerned that Derna's citizens might be killed for helping out Hamet, so he wants to hold out for that reason as well, to make sure that there is a peace treaty in place. So again, another reason that Eden wants to stick around for as long as he can. And on June 5th, this is the kick in the pants right here. This is the cherry on top. On June 5th, morale finally breaks down. Yusef's army begins defecting to Hamet's side. Not just the Bedouins, the actual soldiers in Yusef's army start breaking down, defecting to Hamet, supporting his claim to the throne. Eden sees this and he sends an urgent letter to Baron. He tells him to hold Lear back, stop the negotiations, or at least have Lear play hardball, have Lear demand that the prisoners be released for nothing. But of course, by this time, the preliminary treaty has already been signed. There's nothing to be done, and Lear has had his little victory. So on June 9th, Eden finally reveals the situation to Hamet, and Hamet being Hamet, he was always kind of a cowardly and weak man. He gives up entirely. He's not going to continue to prosecute the civil war without American support. Even though Yusef's army was defecting to him, even though he had control of the second largest city in Tripoli, he was in a tremendously strong position if he just thought about it, because, again, Yusef was at the end of his rope. He had emptied the treasury. He was actively losing support of the Bedouins. If Hamet had had it in him to fight, he had a real chance, but Hamet did not have it in him to fight. He asked to go with Eden when they escaped, and gave up on his claim to the throne of Tripoli. So it really does lend some credence to why Baron and the others were a bit leery of Hamet, were a bit hesitant to support him, but at the same time, it's just a horrible situation. So there's one last denouement before it all ends. On the 10th of Yusef's army leads a desperate attack against they're being racked with defections. They know they have one last chance. They lead a desperate attack, and Hamet, at this point, when it's far too late, finally decides to show courage. He leads his outnumbered forces out onto the field, and he holds brilliantly against several attacks by Yusef's forces, and absolutely wins the day. Far too little, far too late, but Hamet finally shows courage in the final moment. On June 11th, news of the treaty finally arrives, and Eden knows that it's all over. So that day, they begin preparing to leave. And Eden basically summons Hamet and his troops for a secret meeting, supposedly about planning an attack on Yusef's army. But in reality, they all escape under cover of night, board the Argus, and they sail away. As they sail away, Eden hears the citizens in Derna realizing what has happened. He hears the angry shrieks. He hears the despair as they realize they've been sold out by the Americans. And this brings to an end America's first attempt at covert regime change, and it ends like many American attempts at regime change, with the pawn that they were using being absolutely screwed over, for lack of a better word. Hamet was ruined from this. They abandoned people who were counting on them and completely dishonored themselves. Eden, who valued honor so highly, of course, was devastated by this, and I can only imagine how it must have felt hearing those cries as he drifted away from Derna, his tail tucked between his legs. But the Christian mercs get out, the Marines get out, and Hamet's entourage gets out, and it's all over. And that is the end of the operation. That is the end of William Eden's expedition. And that really is the end of our story. It was a brilliant, brilliant military campaign that Eden conducted. One of the most amazing in military history, in my opinion. And it ends due to political BS. It ends due to wheeling and dealing. Ends due to the vanity of Tobias Lear. And it ends with complete dishonor, and with America abandoning a lot of people who were counting on them. And unfortunately, that's a refrain that will continue many, many times throughout the years when America tries to conduct regime change. It happens again and again, and hate to say it, but they started really early on in their history with this pattern. Anyways, the epilogue. William Eaton returned to the U.S. expecting to be a pariah. He expected that because he had abandoned Derna, people would look down on him, that Tobias Lear would be the hero for having made peace. He was 100% incorrect. News of the absolute insanity of his attack on Derna reached the United States, and he became a national hero. He was the most popular man in the United States for a good time, but unfortunately, he couldn't really enjoy it. He still had his debts weighing on him, and the betrayal of Hamet absolutely broke him. He started drinking heavily, It was pretty easy to drink heavily with everyone buying you free drinks everywhere you go since you're a hero. And he also very loudly starts criticizing Jefferson and Lear for their handling of the treaty, for paying that ransom, for screwing over Hammett like that. And that, of course, leads to him becoming a bit of a political pariah. One person who hears Eaton talking about his dissatisfaction with the government is none other than Aaron Burr. And Aaron Burr approaches Eaton, thinks that this guy's disaffected with the US government, so he tries to recruit Eaton as one of the leaders of his rebellion that he's planning in the Spanish territories. But Eaton is a patriot through and through, and even though he hates Jefferson, even though it was probably tempting, he believes in America. He's still a patriot, and so despite his personal animus for Jefferson, he informs Jefferson of the plot. He's the first intelligence that Jefferson gets about the plot, and they're able to act on it. They're able to stop Aaron Burr before he launches a rebellion out to the west, and Eaton plays a key role in preventing that. So, as thanks for foiling Aaron Burr, Congress finally approves Eaton's expenses and even gives him an extra $40,000 as payment for what he did while stopping Burr and in Derna. So Eaton finally gets, after a long time, he gets his debt situation resolved, but unfortunately, he's kind of a wreck. He goes to Richmond in 1807 to testify against Aaron Burr, and while he's there, it's kind of a party atmosphere. He wastes a lot of that money drinking and gambling in Richmond, and when Aaron Burr ends up getting acquitted, that kind of breaks Eaton as well, because he was, again, a patriot, and he didn't understand why this person who tried to overthrow the government got off on a few technicalities, despite his testimony against him. So this breaks Eaton even further, and he quickly fades into obscurity. He drinks heavily, he racks up his debts, he has to sell off most of the land that he has. He actually receives a large amount of land in Maine as thanks for Derna, like the legislature gives that to him. He has to sell it all off. His family is pretty much penniless when he finally dies, penniless and obscure, on June 1st, 1811, at the age of just 47. The Boston Globe runs one sentence about Eaton when he dies, and it calls him a victim of sensibility. And sensibility back then meant basically someone who's easily offended or driven to emotional outbursts at something when something doesn't go their way, when they're angered. So I think that's pretty good way to put it. I think that's a term that should maybe be coming back these days, with how many people are easily offended and angered. But William Eaton, the victim of sensibility. And that is the end of his story. It's not a happy one. It's not a happy one at all. He was truly in my opinion, one of the great stories in American history, one of the great American heroes, and he enjoyed a brief time in the limelight and then got absolutely nothing out of it. And the scars that were inflicted on him, they never healed. He never was able to recover from that moment at Derna of putting away and hearing those people crying out and cursing America for stabbing them in the back. He never recovered, and he died an early death because of it. So it's kind of a sad story, William Eaton. A very sad story that it ended that way, and unfortunately it doesn't end great for a whole lot of people involved in this story. One person it does end well, though, for is Lieutenant Presley O'Bannon. O'Bannon is... if you're in the Marine Corps or you're Marine Corps adjacent, you hear about O'Bannon because he's one of the prototypical Marines. His heroism, things actually end well for him. He was quite the Giga Chad, really held the expedition together, and he's recognized. The Virginia legislature awards him a fancy Mamluk-style sword for his service in Derna, and that becomes the basis for the sword that U.S. Marine officers wear with their dress uniforms even today. You see it on the commercials, you see it all that. Whenever there's a Marine in their dress uniforms, they've got that sword on their side. It's based on the Mamluk-style sword that was awarded to O'Bannon. There's an apocryphal story that it was actually Hammett that gave O'Bannon the sword, but there's no proof of that. It was the Virginia legislature. But O'Bannon goes on to have a really fantastic life. He resigns from the Marines in 1807 and eventually returns to his home of Kentucky. He opens up a whiskey distillery, makes a fortune in real estate, and serves in the state legislature. So somebody gets a happy ending out of this, other than Yusef, at least. But on the right, you can also see the USS O'Bannon, which is a destroyer that was named after him in 1951. So he becomes a figure of legend, especially among the United States Marine Corps. And if you listen to the United States Marine Corps' hymn, what's the first line? From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. It's all down to what Presley O'Bannon and those 8 U.S. Marines managed to do. So Presley O'Bannon at least gets a happy ending out of this, but no one else does. Tobias Lear continues to coddle pirates with taxpayer dollars until 1812. Lear was an idiot. He really was. On top of that terrible treaty he concluded with Tripoli, he also was easily scammed by the pirates. In fact, when the treaty was signed, they threw a gigantic party, the Tripolitanians did, and they conned Lear into paying for that party out of the taxpayer funds. And that's just what he did. He believed that the best way to deal with the pirates was to pay them off with taxpayer dollars at any opportunity. He continued to do that until 1812. Should be noted, he didn't return to the United States until 1812, which was after Eden had finally died, and I think there's probably some reason there why he didn't dare return to the country until Eden was dead. So, once he does return in 1812, he wants to continue his political career. He seeks a cabinet-level post with the Madison administration, but they completely turn him down. They send him to be a low-level accountant for the War Department instead. This was a tremendous blow to his personal ego, no doubt. Also attacking Tobias Lear's ego was the press. The press was, of course, extremely sympathetic to Eden. Whoa. Let's go back. Whoops. The press was extremely sympathetic to Eden. As I said, he was a hero, and they turned against both Jefferson and Lear for concluding that treaty. They began to see Eden's side of things and realized that this was a terrible treaty, that Lear was an idiot for negotiating it, and he became one of the most hated men in America, which had to be hard on his psyche, especially as someone who seemed to base a lot of his worth around those diplomatic achievements, his career success. So, probably unsurprisingly, in 1816, Lear commits suicide. So not a very happy ending for him. I don't think he particularly deserved a happy ending, but he certainly didn't deserve that either, so pretty sad. Finally, Hamet Karamanli. After the disgrace at Derna, Hamet fled to Sicily. He lived in poverty on the $200 a month stipend that the US government gave him. This was their way of taking care of him for putting his neck on the line for the United States. $200 a month. It comes out, I think, to about maybe $4,500 a month, which, I mean, that's a decent living, but you have to keep in mind he was also a noble, so he had a retinue to pay for. He had a household to keep up, and yeah, that really wasn't a whole lot for him to do that with. When the new U.S. consul to Tripoli finally shows up, his name is George Davis, he learns of Lear's secret clause that Yusef doesn't have to release the prisoners, doesn't have to release Hamet's family for quite some time, and he's absolutely outraged. He pressures Yusef, and Yusef finally gives in, like Lear should have done at the start. Yusef finally gives in and releases Hamet's family in 1807. Of course, this only adds to the strain on Hamet's accounts, because now he has even more mouths to feed. He ends up fleeing Sicily and living on Malta for a little while, trying to escape his debtors. But then in 1809, Hamet gets a break. Yusef invites him to serve as the governor of Derna, quite ironically, basically just as a way to keep him under control. As long as he's at Derna, Yusef can keep an eye on him, make sure that Hamet doesn't try anything like that again. But of course, Yusef is a pretty paranoid man. In 1811, he gets the idea that Hamet is plotting against him. He tries to kill Hamet once more, and Hamet flees to Egypt and dies shortly thereafter. So not a particularly good end for Hamet either, though it could have been worse. And finally, what happened to Tripoli? Yusef has a long and very prosperous reign as a pirate king. He lasts all the way until 1832 before, of course, one of his sons betrayed him. They learned from their father, after all. Tripoli descends into a huge civil war, not only between Yusef's sons, but also Hamet's sons, who were pressing their claim to the throne as well. This lasts for about 3 years before, in 1835, the Ottomans realize what a sorry state Tripoli is in, and they assume direct control of their tributary, make it a proper part of the Ottoman Empire, and put an end to the piracy. In 1911, the region gets conquered by Italy, who ruled it until the end of World War II, when it's released as an independent country by the name of Libya. And a few years later, Muammar Gaddafi takes over Libya and continues to mess with the United States. So, kind of a hot spot in a lot of ways, and it doesn't end particularly well for Tripoli either. But that's really the story of William Eaton and his expedition to Derna during the First Barbary War. It was as I've said it so many times during this presentation, but you could not write a story like that. Nobody would believe if you wrote a story like that. But this is what actually happened. William Eaton actually managed to march a ragtag army across 500 miles of desert, something that had never been done before in military history. He managed to overwhelm numerically superior defenders. He managed to hold against Yusef's larger force, and in the end he was backstabbed by this vain little bastard who wanted to score a political win by the name of Tobias Lear. You couldn't write it any better. It's a fascinating, little-known episode in American history. I think William Eaton's profile should be much larger than it is. More people should know his name. It was just a really amazing thing that he did, an amazing episode. And, well, now you know. So hopefully this was informative for you. Hopefully you enjoyed. Let me go ahead and bring up the bibliography here. Main source that I was operating from was Richard Zacks, The Pirate Coast, Thomas Jefferson, The First Marines, and the Secret Mission of 1805. Fantastic book. I can thoroughly recommend it. He kind of jumps around a little bit chronologically, which is the only annoyance, but a fantastic book I can certainly recommend. I was also operating off of my limited recollection of Eaton's own journals. I wrote a paper about this episode way back in horse school a while ago, and during that time I actually found on the internet Eaton's journal, like a scan of it, so I was able to work off of that primary source. I am completely unable to find that on the internet anymore. There's a few places, like the library that actually has possession of the physical journal will let you come and look at it if you pay a ton of money, and I think it's in somewhere on the East Coast, somewhere very far away. There is nothing on the internet anymore of William Eaton's journal, so I kind of just had to operate off of my memory for a lot of that, and I don't feel comfortable citing it as a source, so that's really the only source I was working from for this presentation. Definitely recommend the book by Richard Zacks. It's not, I wouldn't call it a serious historical text. It's not scholarly. It's a bit of a narrative, but I enjoyed it. It's a good read. I think people would enjoy reading that as well if you want to get this story in a bit more detail. But yeah, that is the story of Pirates, Pride, and Promises, William Eaton's expedition to the Barbary Coast. So, with that done, I'd love to open it up to any questions or clarifications that people would like to ask. So just type them on into the chat if you have anything. I'd love to hear from you. Yeah, there we go. Making sure my chat hasn't froze or anything. There we go. Nice. So yeah, if you have any questions or you'd like to know more, I am definitely open to answer a few questions before we close it down for tonight. And if not, we'll probably just bring it to an end. I guess while I'm waiting for questions, I'll tell you kind of the plan for the next few days. I intend to take tomorrow off and then do well, yeah, I'll probably take tomorrow off, do a stream on Friday and Saturday. Not sure quite what I'm going to be streaming yet. I think I'd like to go back and play Chivalry 2 a little bit more. That was a lot of fun. I enjoyed that. So that'll probably be one of the nights, and I'm not quite sure. Maybe some new game. Maybe I'll do that on Saturday. So nothing tomorrow, and then Friday and Saturday expect a stream. The stream on Friday will be late night. I am working that day, but stream on Saturday will be a bit more normal hours since I have Saturday off for the first time in what feels like ever. So yeah, any questions you have, drop them in the chat right now. I'd love to hear from you. Or if I've managed to put everyone to sleep, we'll probably bring the stream to the close. Yeah. This was a fun one. This is one of my favorite stories, I think, in all of history. I'm glad I got to share it. Just the absolute madness of that expedition and the stab in the back. It's got everything. It's got drama, it's got danger, it's got adventure. So much better than any fiction that could be written. It's why I'm the history horse, not the fiction horse. Because it's stuff like this. It's what got me addicted to history. Didn't know most of this. Oh, I'm glad. I'm glad you enjoyed, Deanie. Yeah, we'll just give it another minute for questions. Yeah. Yeah. Oh, and I do mean to say, if you have a suggestion or you have something you'd like me to cover on Horstory, I would love to hear from you. You can send me a DM on YouTube or on Twitter, or just tweet using the hashtag Horstory, and I would love to see it. So, oh, we have a question. Any totals on the captives the Barbary Pirates took over the existence of the Barbary Pirates? Yeah, on the first slide, it's about 1.25 million Europeans, and probably a similar number of West Africans, and that's from 1550 to 1800. It was a pretty big deal. They truly were the boogeyman for anyone in the Mediterranean at the time. Yeah, so probably 2.5 to 3 million would be my guess during their heyday, and most of those slaves got passed on to the Ottomans. The slave market at Constantinople at that time. Yeah, the slave market at Constantinople was the biggest in the world, and so most of them were passed on to be processed by the Ottomans, as long as they were poor and the Barbary pirates couldn't extract a ransom. Obviously, if they could extract a ransom, they would cut out the middleman and just do that. But yeah, any of the poor people that they took would either be forced to serve the pirates themselves, or the vast majority were passed on to the Ottomans at Constantinople. Yeah, it was a big deal. They were no joke, the Barbary pirates, and it did make life in the Mediterranean extremely difficult. Like the French Riviera, which is it's something that really amuses me. Like the French Riviera, which is like this super ritzy, super rich area of France right now, it was one of the poorest and most depressingly deprived places on Earth during this time period, just because it was so dangerous. Nobody wanted to live that close to the Mediterranean because the Barbary pirates were just so dangerous. So yeah, this really ritzy and high-class area today was from 1500 to 1800 one of the poorest and most impoverished places on Earth, just because the pirates raided it continuously. So not so nice and nice at that time. But yeah, that was a good question. All right. Well, I'm not seeing too much else, so Amaki, thank you so much for joining me for this presentation. Your presence here really means the world for me. I can't say how much I appreciate it. It's so glad to finally do another history presentation, especially after the rough month I've had. I'm hoping to have the next one a much quicker turnaround on the next one, because I think some things with work are going to be improving here very, very shortly. We'll have more time to devote to this, but I hope you enjoyed. Hope you learned something. And once again, can't thank you enough for being here. So, until next time, Amaki, I bid you wale. I am Faustus Marius Incitatus, and I'll look forward to seeing you again soon.